What if changing a few words could help change how we think about road safety? Journalist Laura Laker explains why moving from the word accident to collision isn't about blame. It's about accuracy, understanding what really happened, and creating roads that are just better for everyone. This is Streets and People, conversations about people and projects shaping how we move. Find us at getaroundcaboolture.au. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I am very excited to have Laura Laker here in the studio with me. Laura, I know you because you created some media reporting guidelines for road collisions, which I'm super delighted about. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture, and Laura, whereabouts are you?
I'm in London. It's good to be here.
What made you interested in creating media reporting guidelines for road collisions, and why does it still matter to you today?
Someone suggested actually that it was a bit of a gap, and as a journalist who's written about cycling and loved cycling for years, I felt like there was a bit of a disconnect between the sort of risks posed on the roads and how it was reported in reality. You know, I grew up somewhere where you had to learn to drive at 17, everyone was very dependent on the cars, that was the reality. I felt like the way that we talked about road collisions didn't necessarily match what was going on the roads, and I felt like there could be some improvement. So there was this issue of accuracy and talking about the people involved in collisions instead of just the vehicles, and I think that really helps to focus our minds on, and actually research shows this as well, what's going wrong. This is a human problem, really. It's also an infrastructure problem, but it is a solvable problem, and I think once you start to talk about the people involved, then you start to think, oh, hang on, maybe we can change the situation, and maybe we can make improvements to the infrastructure or educate people about what causes the risk on the road and how they can help protect themselves and others around them, using this word accident, which is so common and is so natural. And, I find myself going to say it automatically. Or at least I did in the first. I think I've been doing this for long enough now that I've stopped doing it, but it took a long time. And it's just so automatic. We say it was a car accident, and actually most of the time it's one of sort of 5 things. It's excessive speed, people not wearing seatbelts, it's mobile phone or distracted driving, it's drink or drug driving. And so these are solvable problems, and this is a huge societal problem. Lots of people are killed on the roads, varies from country to country, but it's the biggest killer of young people. I thought let's try and change some of the language around this topic and start to get people to think differently. And actually we can change this and make the roads better for everyone, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting because the first thing you said was it's about excessive speed, and I thought, who's got the excessive speed? And I went, a driver is driving above the speed limit. A driver is driving too fast, but we use these technical terms to hide the fact that someone was actually just driving too fast for the road.
You're exactly right. That's one of the things that I didn't want to start pointing at people and saying, because it's hard for us. I drive, I grew up driving, and sometimes I have to hire a car in London and move stuff around, and I quite enjoy it when it happens. But I think there is a thing that we end up sort of identifying as drivers, and it's hard for us to see that, and you're totally right, it's people driving too fast. And I think sometimes there's a pressure from other drivers, there's a kind of expectation that the speed limit is the target speed, and we need to start to think and deploy our own sort of critical thinking and think it's a built-up area. People could be stepping out from between vehicles just to drive to the kind of conditions as well.
So what does it mean to drive to the conditions? Because that's a sort of a euphemism, vague. I can hear an engineer, we're just driving to the conditions, and I actually don't know what that means.
I guess driving is one of the most dangerous things that we do, as regular people who aren't driving heavy equipment or flying an aeroplane or driving a train. For most of us, driving a car is the most dangerous thing we will do. And I think the way that the car is and the way that the roads are, we forget this. It's just about thinking, what's the visibility like? Is the sun low in the sky? And in the UK, the clocks change every year. At the sort of autumn time of year, you get more collisions and the sun's low in the sky and people don't slow down even though they can't see very well, or the road's wet and you might slip if you brake suddenly and you need to leave longer stopping distances between you and the vehicle in front, or if it's icy, or all of these things.
I've got the guidelines open here, and the URL, it's not a great URL, but it's rc-rg.com / and it's called the Road Collision Reporting Guidelines. How did you go about preparing these guidelines?
So there's some literature around the use of language and including people, and you brought me up on the people driving too fast issue. So stuff like that. We know that using the word accident is not ideal, and there's lots of campaigns, and there has been in the UK, to stop using that language. And by and large, that has had an impact. Professional bodies and government bodies don't tend to use accident anymore, which is a big step forward. And I looked around at similar guidelines. There's suicide reporting guidelines from the Samaritans. The aim is to, ensure that things are reported fairly and that they don't impact other people in a negative way and don't glamorize suicide and all of these things. And it's had a really positive impact on media reporting in the UK and just journalists' understanding, as journalists aren't experts in every subject by and large. A lot of them are generalist news reporters. It was about giving journalists the easiest way to write about road collisions. I looked at what was around, I looked at the literature, I spoke to people in the field, and then I did some sort of draft guidelines based on that, and I put it out for consultation. And then I went around chasing people who I thought were useful. I spoke to journalists and said to them, look, how would this apply to your work, and is this a usable format? And had some quite long conversations with some journalists I respect who work in transport, and they were really helpful. I spoke with academics. I was working with the University of Westminster at the time. They funded the project. So I spoke to people in there who've worked on road safety and transport for years. I went to the police and ambulance and fire services. I went to everyone I could think of who was related to this area, and I put it out for wider consultation and just encouraged anyone to respond. And got some really interesting responses, actually, and people who cycle, for example, were saying we feel like some of the language is quite victim blaming around road collisions, and it'll mention a vehicle hitting a pedestrian and the only person in that sentence is the pedestrian. And so that's where the focus goes. And you think, what was the pedestrian doing that they were hit by this vehicle? And you forget that actually there's two people, and you need to look at what actually happened in the round. And there was a big issue. One of the biggest impacts that you can have is to add the context of the collision. So what's the road like? Are there any crossings nearby? Because if crossings are too far apart, we know that people will not make a long detour on foot. They will try and get across between the crossings. And in America, that's a big cause of pedestrian death, is pedestrians trying to cross and drivers aren't expecting them. Yeah, so having that context is really powerful actually for readers. So I had to add that, of course. And then I looked at the feedback. There was some really touching stuff about I've been affected by road collisions, and a relative had been killed by a driver with an unsafe load on the back, and it was really awful for the family. And they said the way it was reported was really hurtful for us as a family. We felt like people were blaming or focusing on our relative rather than on the driver with the unsafe load, and all of this stuff. Yeah, there was some really powerful testimonials. I talked about how to report on collisions as a journalist in the social media age, around photographs, and I based it around the sort of good practice of kind of journalism as a whole. So the first tenet of good journalism is accuracy, to be accurate, to make sure that you say what happened and not to add or embellish anything, and just to be sensitive with pictures and details, which is basic journalism, but important to add, I think, and just remind journalists. So yeah, that was the process. And then it was a case of rewriting it based on the consultation responses and then putting it out in the world.
And so how long did it take for you to do that?
I think it was a year and a half, possibly a little bit more. I had a 2-year period that I was working with the University of Westminster on a 1-day-a-week basis. So I think it took up a lot of that, and there were quieter periods where we were waiting for the responses, and then there were busier periods where I had to write the final report, do the website, and do the design of the guidelines themselves. So I learned a lot of different things. It had a lot of help and input from the University of Westminster, but the delivery was down to me. It was quite a challenge of my various skills, and I learned some new things along the way.
You're obviously a seasoned journalist. What was it like to be reading about car crashes a lot and hearing testimonials from families?
It's really sad. I did an update, I think it was 2024 it came out, because I was conscious that once the guidelines were out in the world, there was also another job to get people to use them and to do something differently, because you can tell someone something, but you need to show them and to help them integrate it into their work. And we know that a lot of journalists, in terms of immediate road collision reporting. And there's nothing wrong with this. We'll just take the press release from the emergency services who've written something based on their response to the collision, what they've seen at the side of the road, what they know, if they're looking for someone, witnesses and all of this. And they'll copy and paste. And some of the language was actually coming from police. And even though police on the road will know how to talk about road collisions, in the press office it can be slightly different. So staff can be from a different background. They might not know how to term or phrase things. And there's research from America where they worked with police on their press releases to try and improve language downstream, which then affects how people see collisions as readers. There's a number of police forces across the UK, regional, local police forces. So I went to them and I talked to them about using the guidelines. And I also did an analysis of their press releases. I think I took 3 or 4 from each force across the UK, and the University of Westminster helped me to do the textual analysis of these reports. You know, in collecting these road collision reports, I saw the other press releases that police had put out and all of the awful things that they have to deal with. And I have a huge amount of respect for roads police, but also it's all in the sort of news page of these forces. You see all of the awful things that they have to deal with. And it really gave me a respect for police and emergency response services. Yeah, I did another research project actually about pedestrian deaths on pavements, because I was interested in sometimes even the pavements aren't safe from the worst drivers. And I managed to find some of the collision details from press releases and look at the sites on Google Maps and really go into granular detail about what had happened when about 40 pedestrians are killed on UK pavements a year. I really got to see some of the worst cases of dangerous driving. Sometimes it was a medical episode and the person shouldn't have been driving, but sometimes it was just someone going on a sort of rogue spree. And that's really very sobering, actually, because of course most of us will see a news story here or there, but we won't read anything more about it once the main thing's over. And you get the tributes to the deceased from the loved ones and you hear about their life and you think, gosh, you really get a sense of life's cut short. It's really very sobering. Writing about transport generally, you're not often confronted with beat reporting like that. So after a day of looking at that, you just think, gosh, I think I need to do something a bit cheerful and be grateful to be alive.
And so as a result of the shift in the language, have you seen whether that's had any knock-on effect onto crash rates and the severity, or has there been a sort of social shift at all?
I think it's really hard to tell in terms of road collisions and the impact on those. I think because there's so many factors at play, and also here in the UK our court system is extremely underfunded, and so there's years of wait. If someone's killed on the roads, there was a cyclist killed just near me a couple of years ago, I think, and the coroner's date keeps getting pushed back 6 months at a time, and it really drags on. But also there's so many different factors at play in a road collision, and then you have to have the police report which comes out often a couple of years down the line, and I think it would be very hard to attribute, because you'd have to look at the attitude of the driver versus their attitude before. I think it would be impossible. I do know that after the guidelines came out, and I'm not saying the guidelines alone did this, but I think it might have been the sort of straw that broke the camel's back. National Highways, the body that runs the sort of trunk roads and the motorways in England, they stopped using accident on their digital display boards on the gantries over the roads, and people have been saying to them for years, you need to change your language, this is no longer best practice, you say collision instead. And they did resist, but eventually they said our guidance is going to be updated and we're going to say collision instead. So that felt like a big win, because that's people are driving along and saying, thinking, okay, not an accident but a collision, and those little shifts. So that's helped, and I think in the professional world that has shifted a little bit. I think in terms of the media and police, there is still a way to go to get them to actually change. I think they understand, but I still think they need reminding. It almost needs someone to see a news piece and just say, had you thought of phrasing this differently? I mean, what tends to happen is people get angry on social media and say, why aren't you using these guidelines? And just really pointing a finger and being quite unhelpful. I don't think anyone's going to change if that's how they're being spoken to online. I think if you could do it in a helpful way, I'm looking into getting some funding for that here in the UK, just to work with police a little bit more and maybe create some sort of dashboard so that they can see how others are performing, because I think gamifying these things can be quite motivating for a force, having a bit of competition and seeing who's doing the best and who needs to catch up. And so that's something I would like to do.
That's a very interesting take. So when you talk about gamifying, you're saying how many media reports that they have which use the better language. Is that what you're saying?
I think it would probably be more like wholesale uptake of the guidelines. So if they're regularly saying, a vehicle being driven instead of just a vehicle crashed, a vehicle being driven on X road, or just mentioning that there was a driver present, it's those simple tweaks, and then adding stuff like other context, collision data perhaps from the area. Like I was saying at the start, drink and drug driving, speeding, all of these behaviours are disproportionately implicated in collisions. So if there was a case of speeding, they could say there were X speeding related collisions in our area in X year, or just try and relate it to a wider context. Evidence shows that has a really big impact. Yeah, just little tweaks to the press releases, because I think even though I got a great deal of support, behaviour change is hard, and I think it's good to appreciate that, and people need to be walked through it, and then eventually it'll become the norm, but it is a bit of a journey.
On the website, you've got the guidelines, which is certainly the one that I use. Then there's the consultation report, so that's where you've stepped through everything, the references, and the accessible format guidelines. What has been the most difficult for people to rephrase?
I think it's the driver versus car. Well, I know it's a driver versus car element. And there was a lot of fear, including from journalists, that saying a driver hit X would be considered blaming the driver somehow. It's still something that's not really resolved in people's minds. I think it's quite a tricky one. But I would say my kind of response to that is if it was a cyclist or a pedestrian, you'd say the person. It's not blaming someone by saying that there was a collision or that if a driver hits a tree. And I think people will also say that if there was a medical episode, it wasn't deliberate, but actually there was an awful case in London a couple of years ago where a woman was driving a Range Rover and she crashed into a primary school garden through a fence, and there was a picnic happening and she killed 2 children. And even after it was decided that it had been a medical episode, the Guardian was reporting it as the driver hit rather than the vehicle hit. And you can see examples of where this language has been used, but I think we have a natural bias towards not mentioning them if they're driving for fear of blaming them. That's been a tricky one. You can word it in all sorts of ways. You could say a vehicle being driven. If a police press office worker was writing something, they could say a vehicle being driven. Often the vehicle make and model is referenced, because if someone's seen the vehicle being driven at some other point, they might have evidence, they might have witnessed something. You could say an X kind of vehicle being driven down X road, and without really changing or having to worry about that thing of a driver doing X. There were some quite extreme examples in some of the news reporting that I've seen since. The offending vehicle fled the scene was one of them, and it's legally impossible for a vehicle to offend. I mean, I don't know what the case is with autonomous vehicles, but they were far less of a thing when the guidelines came out. But for sure, if they know there was a driver involved, then saying offending vehicle, that's the kind of extreme it goes to. So you could definitely easily cut those out, because that's just factually inaccurate.
I was just thinking about these guidelines. So have you seen them being taken up in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Africa, other places where it's English speaking?
I think people have taken an interest, but I genuinely don't know to what extent people have taken them up overseas. I think they've inspired other guidelines. I've been contacted by various people who've been interested in them over the years, including from African nations. And yeah, I remember doing an international talk a few years ago about them, and people were very interested. But I genuinely don't know what people have taken away or taken from them. And obviously the context is slightly different. What you can say in the media is different in some places. So I guess they would be tweaked for the local context. But I think there has been some interest, and there's been some sort of replication. I think in the Netherlands there was a similar piece of work being done, because even there, where all road users are much more equal, people still have this idea of a car being the unit on the road instead of the driver.
So I see actually on news websites the word accident, and actually the tag at the top says road accidents. I keep writing to this agency, which is generally a responsible agency. What could I do to encourage them? What's the best way of approaching the media agency?
In my experience here in the UK, journalists don't like being told how to do their jobs, I've realised. That was a really tricky one, getting people to do something different and understanding why it was important. The reason for the project I did in 2024 working with police was that actually what you might find is that some of the language comes from those police. What I've done is worked back in these cases and found out which police force put out the press release, and you can go on their website and they'll have a list of press releases, and you can see you could contact them actually, and they're much more more likely to be amenable to changing their language, and then that feeds through to the media. And I really think that's the best approach. Yeah, because you can gently point media to the guidelines, but I think what will create the change is when the professionals start using the language themselves, and then that sort of feeds through. It is a slow process ultimately, unfortunately, because behaviour change is slow, but I do think that's the best way. Or if it was an ambulance service that sent out the press release, to be fair, police don't use accident in this country anymore, but where there's a sort of vehicle did this, then quite often you go back and it's from the police report, or the journalist has extrapolated from the police report. That'd be what I would do, obviously politely and nicely and just in a helpful way, because I always find that gets a better response.
In my frustration, it's been on one of the social media things, and I'm going, oh, it's not an accident, it's a collision or a car crash. And don't you get on your high horse? And it's because I get so frustrated because I see the same thing over and over. So I feel like I've seen it 1,000 times, but they've actually only received it for the first time, in fact.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's easy to forget when you've been down this road so far that this kind of journey of, oh yeah, the way that people talk about X is wrong, or the way that we think about this is wrong. To think that everyone's been on that journey too. I think it's human nature, and I do this as well. I think it's really important just to be patient, and even if it is someone that's done the same thing multiple times, I just think generally if you're campaigning for something, just to be a positive and helpful presence is so much more effective.
I know in theory, and then I just go, what? I just see it and I see red. I just go a little bit nuts on that one. I just think about people who have been killed, and one of my colleagues is, her daughter died, and it's just heart-wrenching. And I'm actually listening to an audiobook about somebody who was in the car that was in a crash with there were 6 people in the car. And just the impact on that driver, he's now a much older man, and just it's heart-wrenching. And it doesn't matter whether you are the driver or a passenger or a family of a victim, it's all awful. And I think that's one of the things that's really important to remember. Nobody wins in this situation.
Yeah, it's absolutely devastating, and the devastation ripples out, and there's so many implications, and they can be lifelong. And of course there's also the lifelong injuries, which we don't talk about. My dad had one leg shorter than the other because of a collision. A driver hit him when he was cycling as a boy, actually, and it had an impact for the rest of his life. I think there's about 20,000 serious injuries in the UK every year, and these are all life-changing injuries to meet that description. So yeah, it's huge, but I think it's worth stepping back from these, and social media facilitates angry discourse because that's what keeps people on it and makes money for the social media companies. I think people are realizing now that actually this is not a great kind of medium for human well-being and health. And I think remembering the people who are working on this, and if we're talking about emergency services, they go to work wanting to do a good job. They might not always get it right, but that's being human, isn't it? We all make mistakes, and I think having that humanity, just taking a breath and walking away from something and coming back and thinking, okay, how can I interact with this in a helpful way? I just finished a project, actually. It was about rural paths, because in the UK, as with a lot of places around the world, there aren't really that many places to walk and cycle that aren't shared with quite fast-moving motor traffic drivers. I looked at what some successful campaigners were doing in rural areas in terms of trying to get safe paths built. Yeah, this is one of the things that I learned from them, is that the ones that succeed are the ones that really build relationships locally and get everyone behind a project and make themselves a positive, helpful presence, play the long game a little bit. And I've seen plenty of campaigners over the years fall by the wayside just by being angry. And yeah, like you say, there's good reason to be angry. It's a long game, unfortunately.
In Australia, the stats are about 3 people a day are killed in a car crash, and 2 people each hour live a car crash with a serious injury, which means probably a disability or some kind of impact like your father. So say a mother in a mum's group, she's listening to this and she's thinking, what can I do to change this kind of conversation? What do you suggest something she could do?
I guess, like everything, it's about having conversations with people. And I think whichever kind of social network you're part of or professional network, I think you can start discussions. And I think face-to-face chats are so much better in this. I think sort of social networks, however, that things can get misinterpreted quite easily. I think face-to-face is something human that we want to get on. And I think that we remember this actually when we see people face to face. And I've had discussions with people who, if we'd had the discussion online, who've held different views to me or different perspectives. And I loved talking to people. I love finding out. And I love that everyone's different and everyone has a different perspective. And I can be wrong and be proved wrong. And that's great as well, because that's how we grow, isn't it? But yeah, I think having those conversations face to face and just understanding. And sometimes it's not the thing that someone says that they're worried about. There's something else going on underneath it. There's a concern for a loved one who's in a certain situation and they feel like something is threatening that in one way or other. So I think having those chats can be really powerful. But if you particularly care about the language in media, you can talk to the local police, you can express concerns. If you're concerned about a particular stretch of road, you could find the data and start promoting. If there's a particular collision hotspot, you could start saying, well, so many collisions has happened here in so long, and maybe we should try and do something about this. Or if you need a crossing in your area, you can use data, and it can be really powerful in storytelling. But I think also having those human examples, that really hits home. I think even more than the stats is sort of understanding other people's perspectives and the impact that something has had on them.
One of our biggest supporters is somebody with a disability who's in insecure housing. Now, he's not embedded in a community and he's had to move around a lot, has limited capacity to focus because of the chronic pain. He doesn't drive anymore. What's something he could do to help shift the conversation away from, say, accident to collision?
If you have a perspective in terms of you want safer roads, I think contacting your local news organisation if you're feeling brave, and I know this can be quite intimidating for people, but I think representing the positive support of schemes to improve safety on the roads, or to speak differently about things, or to think differently about how the roads operate in your area can be really powerful. And I know that you often get people who are against things, against change, and it's natural, it's human nature, against slower speeds or against a cycle lane, and again, it's totally natural, people don't like change. But I think being a positive voice and saying, actually, it would be good if we had a safe crossing here, or it would be nice if the speeds were lower given that there's been so many collisions here, or I think offering your viewpoint on the positive side can be quite powerful. And I know social media, again, it can really skew towards people who are against things and want the status quo, and so we can all make the mistake of thinking that everybody feels this way, and it can be quite the opposite, actually. I think a lot of people might look at the current road systems in many countries around the world and think, actually, this doesn't work. It's very dominated by traffic. What about residential streets? What about where children might want to cycle or play out on the pavements and not have to worry about speeding drivers? I think just being that voice that's standing up for, if you're feeling brave enough, or at least making yourself available to be out there and representing something positive.
And so say the council put out a media release. Now, somebody's junior, they might be quite new in the transport team. How could they approach, say, the media team about that issue of how to best report?
I think just gently approaching people with a different perspective and saying, have you heard of the guidelines? Have you considered talking about this in a different way? Sometimes people might not have considered it at all, and it might be a totally new idea. And I think, again, going to these conversations with an open mind and an open heart in a way, and just relating to someone on a person-to-person basis and thinking, just seeing where they are and taking them with you on that journey, and saying we can improve the accuracy of our coverage if we don't presume that it's an accident, for example, because an accident presupposes that it's just one of those things that nothing can be done, or that's what we tend to imagine when we hear that word or we read that word. Gently taking them along the journey and saying, had you thought about putting collision statistics in, or adding some context or other to reports, and just helping people understand why the council or the local authority might be trying to change something, or just talking to them, I think, person to person.
That's actually a very good point, because I know one of the councillors, I listened to the council meetings. I heard that in one of the divisions in our council that they are going to put in protected bike lane. And so I think that it can be useful. So I was going to contact that councillor anyway, and now I have a really good reason to say, by the way, if you have the crash data, this is something to think about when speaking with your constituents?
I'm a big fan of data, but I think also having personal stories can have a big impact on people. What's it like in the area at the moment? What would it mean if you could cycle? And I think if something like that is being proposed in your area, then being a positive voice in the council and my toolkit, which I can send you a link to, one of the elements that I took from these amazing campaigners who'd eventually succeeded with their paths was that they'd really been a bit of a support actually for the councillor. And in the UK, councillors are quite often poorly paid. They're doing it outside of other jobs, and they get a lot of negativity on email and social media. And just one supportive email or a group of people standing up for what they're proposing can make a huge difference, just in terms of helping them feel that this is something that they should be doing, that people want. Because otherwise, what you'll get inevitably, and again, people don't like change, it's totally normal, will be the folks sort of shouting and saying, oh my goodness, why are we doing this? What a waste of money. It's going to affect the traffic. And none of these things are true, but they're understandable. But I think it's really important that there's a voice on the other side saying, actually, the moment my children can't cycle out, I'd like to be able to not have a second, third car in the household. Maybe I could use this to get to the shops or friends or social engagement, sports, and all of that. And the health benefits obviously are huge, just being able to weave in activity in your day. I think that would be a really powerful thing for a local politician to hear, because it's actually quite rare that happens. And I think it can have an outsized effect.
I definitely would agree with that. It's been very helpful to start to write to my local councillors and all my local politicians and just go, I really like that you did that. And sometimes it's small. I saw in the council meeting, I really liked the way that you phrased that or you spoke about that. It's huge. One time I wrote a letter to the Premier in a previous situation, and I just said, this is just very difficult for you to deal with, and it must be exhausting for you. And it was a particular big thing. And I got this Dear Wendy and personally signed from the Premier. I mean, it's huge. They get so little, and it was just like, thank you for your kind words. They get so much abuse, and certainly councillors get a huge amount of just horrific abuse. So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, and I think it's gotten worse. I think it's even more important when something good is happening, even if it's not perfect. Things aren't going to be perfect, but if something positive is happening, I think it's worth celebrating and thanking those people for standing up and for something they believe in, despite the sort of scary shouting that they might have.
So is there anything else before we close out that maybe you would like to add?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's Streets and People. Thanks for listening. You can find more at getaroundcaboolture.au. This podcast is shaped by our community. Do you know someone doing great work in transport or have a topic you'd like us to explore? Please send us your suggestions. We're always looking for new ideas and would love to hear from our community.